So as we move into the 1700s, the big thing that is developing in English language is that it's starting to be standardised. In other words, there are starting to be rules, there are starting to be spellings that are accepted, there are starting to be grammatical forms that are being accepted. That's a big movement that's going on in the 1700s, whereas the 1600s is almost a bit of a Wild West. There's very few set rules, and dialects will be different in different parts of the country. In the 1700s, for a few different reasons, the language starts to get standardised, and that's a key thing that you're probably going to be looking at in texts from the 1700s if they come up. The first thing that I think is worth looking at is Haugen. Now, Haugen is a linguist, so it's quite helpful if you're bringing in examples to support the ideas that you're coming out with. It shows a breadth of understanding for AO4. If you're using Haugen to compare where these texts are, that can be a really helpful way of showing you've got this conceptual understanding of how language is changing. So Haugen says there's 5 stages of codification or of standardization or of accepting a version of a language. Firstly, the dialect is selected. Well, that happens way back when the printing press comes out, way back when London Midland English is chosen as the dialect that's used in printed text. So a dialect has been selected because of trade, because that's where the universities are. Secondly, Haugen says that starts to then be codified. We start to understand what the rules are of that dialect. Okay, how is that dialect different to one that's spoken 50 miles up the road? Thirdly, that's elaborated on. Okay, we develop it. We maybe adapt that dialect slightly further to make it work for us, and we understand exactly what is it that makes that dialect different to the others. And then step 4, you implement it. You set out those rules to everybody and set out that they are the correct version of the language. Even though it's quite random which dialect gets chosen, it is then implemented as being the correct one. And finally, that's widely accepted. People start to speak and write in that dialect. And a good thing that you can debate with really here is what's going on in any text that you see. What stage do we seem to be at? A big move really that changes from the 1600s broadly to the 1700s is that we go from a language being sort of selected and semi-codified and semi-understood to it really being implemented and sort of accepted by the end of the 1700s. But it's not a simple process. You don't simply move from one step to the other. So you might see a text from the early 1700s that shows very little evidence of the implementation of a standard dialect. The spellings might still be quite irregular. But similarly, you might see a text from later on in the 1700s that hasn't quite shown that implementation either. It's a key idea really to debate with and to discuss with where we are in these texts. How does one text show more implementation than another? Okay. Similarly, though, if it's a later text, you could debate that. It might be that a later text actually challenges some of the rules of standard English, in which case you can go back to Haugen and show how adaptations to this dialect are still being discussed today. I think crucially, it is not about a generalised comment. You don't want to look at a text and go, it's 1701, so therefore everything is fully implemented with the London Midland dialect. All the spellings are regular, all the grammatical forms are regular because it's 1701, so it's the 1700, so it must be. Because actually, from 1699 to 1701, not a fat lot has changed really. This is a process that goes on over time. You might see a text from the 1750s and 1760s that still shows some evidence of the dialect not quite being standardised, some spellings that aren't quite the same, some grammatical forms that aren't quite the same. Discuss why that might be the case. Okay, so it's looking at this process and debating with the evidence that sort of shows where we might be with Haugen's model. The big thing contextually that's going on in the 1700s is the Enlightenment. It's known as the Age of Reason. This idea that reasoning and using rationality and using science and using rational arguments was the way of improving and understanding humanity. And that's a big movement that we get throughout the 1700s. And it impacts on texts for all sorts of reasons. We're likely to see simply a greater scientific focus on text in the 1700s. They're more likely to be about scientific things. But similarly, the way that they are written is likely to be much clearer as well to sort of fit with the Enlightenment. You're going to get lots of long multi-clausal sentences to show detailed reasoning. You're going to get texts that tend to set out rational arguments and their reasons for thinking it, rather than going for more emotional ideas. You're going to see texts that are debating the human condition, what it means to be human, or making key ideas about how humanity can improve itself. They're the sort of things contextually that are going on in the 1700s, and that's what you're going to be probably interrogating and looking at in texts that you get. And I've got a text from the 1700s to show you in the next video. You're also getting, in terms of the actual lexis and grammatical forms, you're getting an end of what was known as really the Wild West of English in the 1600s. You're starting to get rules. So in the late 1600s, John Dryden says those who corrupt our idiom by mixing it too much with French. He sort of calls those people out. So we're getting this idea of English being its own language and being important and something that needs protecting. That crumbling castle idea from Jean Aitchison, right from the late 1600s, we're starting to get that, and it really spreads then into the 1700s. We get Joseph Addison in the early 1700s, who complains about contractions of can't rather than cannot, which he says has untuned our language and clogged it with consonants. Again, notice that idea, almost that damp spoon idea, that it's just a bit distasteful if you don't speak in the proper way. Daniel Defoe, right at the end of the 1600s, talks about the inundation of swear words in English, advocates for the creation of an academy that's going to protect the English language. So we're getting these very prescriptivist ideas, in other words, ideas about what's right and what's wrong about English language, coming in at the end of the 1600s. They're really influencing the 1700s. That's why what we get in the 1700s is more standardized spelling, less use of contractions, longer sentences that have many clauses that show reason and rational argument, a greater impact of Latin, because that was the movement that was going on. Samuel Johnson actually designed a dictionary in 1755. Okay, and we can almost see him as the original prescriptivist, because his dictionary wasn't just giving us definitions; it was also giving us the correct way of speaking. He didn't just want to tell us what words meant; he wanted to tell us what words were good and what words were bad, and what words we should and shouldn't be using. So he says that those who have been persuaded to think well of my design require that it should fix our language and put a stop to those alterations. That's what he's trying to do: fix the language. Okay, hold it steady, stop it changing, which time and chance have hitherto been suffered to make in it without opposition. When we see men grow old and die at a certain time, one after another, from century to century, we laugh at the elixir that promises to prolong life to 1,000 years, and with equal justice may the lexicographer be derided, who, being able to produce the example of a nation that has preserved their words and phrases from mutability, shall imagine that his dictionary can embalm his language and secure it from corruption and decay, that it is in his power to change sublunary nature, or clear the world at once from folly, vanity, and affectation. Okay, what he's talking about here is that his dictionary, he's sort of saying that he probably won't be able to do that, but that's sort of how people are seeing his dictionary, that it's something that's going to fix the language, it's going to embalm it and hold it still and stop it changing. And that's, nowadays we tend to think his dictionaries as being quite neutral records of words and what they mean. That wasn't necessarily the aim in the 1700s, this big aim that language needs to be held and protected and made beautiful and made rational. We see that in his definition of oats. He says it's a grain which in England is given to horses and in Scotland feeds the people. Okay, a bit of shade sort of thrown there at the Scots by Samuel Johnson, but we see this is not a neutral record of words. There are lots of opinions and lots of prescriptivist ideas that are coming in here about what is good and bad language. And actually we see that in America as well. By the early 1800s, Noah Webster has an American dictionary. American spellings are slightly different to British spellings, but notice what he says there. What does he want to do with American English? I want to omit all superfluous and silent letters. That's why there's not a U in colour in America, because for Noah Webster, they're silent, they're superfluous. What's the point? He says, I want to substitute a character that has a certain definite sound for one that is more vague and indeterminate. So he replaces S's with Z's in realise. He puts a Z in because a Z sound is a Z. That makes more sense than an S in that word. So Webster himself is a prescriptivist. He's got a slightly different version of English, but notice his reason for doing that is, I want to fix this language and make it more beautiful. He says language is the expression of ideas, and if the people of one country cannot preserve an identity of ideas, they cannot retain an identity of language. So just like in Britain, it's all about the protection of the language. And then you get this kind of this interesting sort of divide here. Thomas Hamilton in the early 1800s says the amount of bad grammar in circulation is very great. That of barbarism is enormous, and the dire prediction in another century, the dialect to the Americans will become utterly unintelligible to an Englishman. Samuel Johnson, tongues like governments have a natural tendency to degenerate. We've long preserved our constitution. Let us make some struggles for our language. So we get in these two schools of thought here. Webster saying, I'm making the language better because it needs to be improved. And the British academics saying, oh, it's ruining our language. Notice on both sides of the Atlantic, both of these people have this idea that if you fix language, you improve society. Contextually, the other big thing that's going on is the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so the massive growth in technology and the massive growth in urbanisation as people were moving to the cities to work in factories, whereas previously they'd led a more agricultural lifestyle. That's going to have all sorts of impacts, partly in what the texts are actually about. They're more likely to be about this urban way of life or new development or business, but also because there are literally new inventions, there are literally new machines. So you might well get the coinage of new terms, new technical terms to do with things that are made. There's wider access to education. More people living in towns and cities would then be educated in free schools as we got into the 1800s. So you're starting to get a wider readership of written text. We can no longer assume, like we would in the 1600s, that most written texts were only for a very narrow audience. It's starting to grow. That's going to change the language that's used. More people are living in these urban areas, so there's going to be more focus on issues related to that: hospitals, sanitation, education, their work, the factories. You're going to get greater focus on reason and science, so that the texts are more likely to be about that and show their reasoning. And this growing middle class. Okay, so this idea that some people could get quite rich in the Industrial Revolution. It was no longer just the upper classes who had the wealth. That doesn't mean that everybody had great opportunities. Some people were still living in real abject poverty, but for some, those opportunities were there. That meant that you had a slightly wider readership, slightly wider access to education, slightly wider access to wealth. But equally, you want to avoid generalisations. You don't want to just see a text from the 1700s and say, oh, it's about all of these things. Because actually, I've just wanted to show you those John Constable paintings. It's the complete opposite, isn't it? It's rural landscapes. It's the countryside. And John Constable, writing at the end of the 1700s, early 1800s, shows that there is a bit of a backlash here in art, in poetry, in literature. As more and more people move into towns and cities and become more occupied with urban concerns, you're getting this focus from a number of writers and artists that we're losing the natural world, and they therefore focus more on it. And we're losing our innocence, the idea, in the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so don't panic if you see a text that's about, something entirely rural and countryside from the 1700s, because it's probably written in response to the Industrial Revolution. Lead with what is in the text, follow that, and look for the kind of evidence of what you could say about what was going on in the world at that time. We get the Romantics in the late 1700s, early 1800s, William Wordsworth being an example of one of those poets who, what he feels is he wants to do with poetry what Constable did with art. He wants to make it more democratic. He feels that the earlier poets were a bit elitist. It's highbrow language. There's Latin references. There's references to classical mythology. Wordsworth says, no, I want to write for ordinary people. He says, I want to write my poetry in the language really spoken by men. Okay, so the Romantics, led by William Wordsworth, set up a new and restless spirit, seeking violently to burst through old and cramping forms. The reason I've said that is kind of going back to that point I made at the start with Haugen. You don't want to just see a text from the 1700s and go, oh, it's got lots of really long sentences, lots of references to Latin, it's got lots of references to science, lots of really detailed reason. Chances are it may well have all those things, and if it does, then great. But you may see a text that kind of does the opposite, almost as a bit of a pushback. It might be about nature, it might be written quite simply, it might not have all these long multi-clausal sentences, particularly if it's later in the 1700s, as the author might be almost deliberately fighting against those ideas. In the next video, I've got an example text from the 1700s where I'll go through what you could perhaps say about the lexis, about the grammar, about the orthography, and about the context. So we'll look at an actual text from the 1700s and unpick this and think, right, if that came up, what could we actually say about it? How could we form some interesting ideas?